Morning, everybody. My name is Roderick Parks. I'm the Research Director of the DGAP. Thank you for joining us at very short notice this morning to make sense of current events. I suspect most of us greeted what happened on the weekends with a dual sense. Firstly, perhaps that it was a little bit predictable in hindsight because we've been following this feud for many weeks now. And secondly, that it was good news given the coincidence with the Ukrainian offensive. And I suspect that's a bit of a dangerous bias. And if we're honest, most of us don't know why what happened. Was it to prevent Wagner's incorporation into the Russian military? Was it to topple Putin? Was it to protect him from his defense minister and his advice? We don't know how it happened under the noses of the Russian security services. And we certainly don't know what will happen next, whether it be Prigozhin's impunity or the broader picture for the conflict in Ukraine. I will hand over immediately with that to Anastasia Pociumban, who's very kindly agreed to moderate the session, guide us through. She'll introduce the speakers in a second. Very quickly to introduce Nastia, though. Nastia works on the EU's Eastern Partnership, so its approach to its neighbours in the East, and she is a fellow in our DGAP program on Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. Nastia, over to you.
Thank you, Roderick, and good morning, everyone. So we are so really happy to see so many people at an early hour. And I think, as Roderick mentioned, many of us have followed Wagner's short-lived rebellion in the weekend, more like a telenovela, I think, how he moved to Rostov-on-Don and then seized it, and then the movement further in the direction of Moscow. But then as well, its sudden end and the aftermath of it, including Prigozhin and then Putin's speeches. And we are here really today to try to make sense of it and to understand what happened. What does this mean, and also what are the implications? Before I pass it to the speakers that I have a pleasure to have here, I'd introduce them briefly. I have my colleague Stefan Meister, who's the head of Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia, and my colleague András Racz, who's a senior research fellow in the same center. I think they are well familiar to you, especially when you join our morning briefings. And before I pass it on, we have some housekeeping. Stefan and András will have their input speeches for around 5-7 minutes, and then I will open the floor for questions and comments. We have to end at 9:15. Therefore, please keep your input short and sharp and to the point. And if you particularly have some insights you would like to share, we are also welcoming that. Stefan, the floor is yours. I would like to ask you to reflect a bit on what does this rebellion really means for Russia and what are the implications on domestic policy and on the situation in the country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. I have to say, I think a lot of is Kremlin astrology also in a way. So I think we know some things, we can assess some structural developments, but I think we also understand that this is quite a black box where a lot of things going beyond what is visible on. And the whole thing around Lukashenko, for instance, I think is for me still not entirely clear, even if I think that this is also about that Putin didn't want to speak with Prigozhin personally, so he needed someone to be a kind of intermediator. So I just want to make sense from my perspective out what happened there. I think if we look into the structural framework, the business model of private militaries, of private army in Russia, even if it's now growing, I think it's coming to an end. The whole idea of Wagner, which was founded in 2014, was to have this hybrid attacks, to have not the Russian military, an official state who is fighting in some wars, but to have some private actors who you cannot link with the Russian state. And I think the Russian army now, with this war, is in a competition in hiring people with Wagner, for instance, but also with other private enterprises in this field. And Wagner became official, and it became an official part of the war against Ukraine. So its initial aim is not there anymore with this war. And the Russian state needs every man and woman who can fight in Ukraine, and to hire even in jails people. So there is a kind of a competition. And I think what we saw was a couple of weeks ago, the decision that there should be a registration of all private troops, private fighters, and Wagner was not willing to do this because they would have come under the guidance of the Minister of the Defense, and also in the end then also of the General Staff. And I think that was nothing which was acceptable for Prigozhin personally, and also he would have lost also his autonomy to some extent. I think the second point for me is it was always Putin who protected Prigozhin. Also as a person, he was highly unpopular in the top level of the military. There were some people who were supportive with him, but I think especially on the General Staff and also the Minister of Defense, we have seen this kind of power fight, or this official visible in social media fight. So he was highly unpopular. And I would say my impression is that Putin dumped him down a couple of weeks ago. So he was somehow free also to be killed, to lose this role. And I think there were kind of attacks also on Wagner positions. And for Prigozhin, it was who had no direct contact with Putin. He had to come in a bargaining position with Putin. So I think this kind of coup, or this kind of what happened on the weekend, I'm not so sure if it's really a coup, was about challenging on one end the Russian military in a way, but then also getting the attention of Mr. Putin and coming in a bargaining position to get an agreement for his personal survival, and also negotiate on the future of Wagner. So that is at least my interpretation of what we have seen. And I think he in a way won. He won that he can leave to Belarus. And on the other hand, I think we will see an integration of Wagner into the Russian army, but this is still in a limbo, and it's still not really finally accepted by everybody. So I think and I think that's the most interesting thing for me on the whole event is we see the weaknesses of the Putin system. We see that the highly personalized system is not able to act when the president is not making a decision. There was no speaking paper on the weekend for official Russia because Putin did not make a decision. He had a speech where he looked highly out of the reality. He was talking about history. He was talking about the West. Yeah, sure. He was also talking about traders. But I think that was the moment to immediately act, to show that he is controlling the situation. But the Russian state lost for some hours the power of force, in Russia, in Russia itself. And we can see that this war is coming back to Russia. We can see that the whole privatization of the army, they lost the control over parts of the troops, and it was you can say it was too late to try to get it back, to try to get it under control, especially with a person like Prigozhin, who is not willing to get under control of the Minister of Defense and of the General Staff, which he sees as his main competitors. I think we were also surprised how easily Wagner could move to in the direction of Moscow. So I think there seems to be really most of the troops in Ukraine. But there's not much left over in Russia. And we can thirdly also see if there is a black swan, something happens, the system is not prepared, it's not flexible enough to react adequate in this situation. And it shows to everybody really the weaknesses of a Putin who is losing more and more the reality, who might not really have all the information he should have, who very few people have access to, and who makes a decision, we don't know where. Maybe he's in Sochi, maybe he's somewhere else. And I think if he's not reacting, the system is in chaos. and is acting and doing something. And I think that shows also, if we're looking a little bit more in middle and long term, that if other things will happen in Russia, I think the system might not be able to act. What I would expect now is a kind of a cleansing in the system, possibly. Putin needs to show strength. I also think that the personal life of Prigozhin is not really safe. I think he has to set an example. It's unacceptable for the system also, which normally shows strength. But I think also internally, I can imagine more repression, more repression also against the security people. Really, a kind of cleansing, possibly. That's an option at least, and showing strength inside of Russia. So maybe I stop here at this point and give it back to Nastya.
Thank you, Stefan. I will now hand it to András, and then I come back with some follow-up questions. András, I'd like to have your take on the events and really to understand what's your assessment. How could this happen in the first place? And also, what does it trigger now? What Stefan said, we are speculating now, and it was a bit, I think we could also just do bets today and then see what happens in a few months. But really, what's your assessment? And also, if you could reflect a bit, what does it mean for Russia's war against Ukraine? How is this changing the situation? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for joining us today morning. And Nastya, trying to answer your question on what exactly happened, I fully agree with Stefan with the inability of the Russian state to act properly has been exposed more clearer than ever before. From the security military point of view, it was staggering how unopposed Wagner could take over Rostov, including the headquarters of the southern military districts from where the operation against Ukraine is directed, and also how practically unopposed the Wagner was heading to Moscow. Why did I say practically unopposed? Because there were attempts from the Russian Air Force to disrupt the convoy, but Wagner started to shoot down helicopters, and then the Air Force was ordered to stand down. There were efforts from Rosgvardia units at Zvoronezh to counter the convoy, but the convoy simply broke through. So all these episodes support the assessment that the Kremlin technically easily had the power at its hands to disrupt the whole thing. It's possible to send attack helicopters against the convoy. You could send in Spetsnaz forces. The Chechens were already on the way, but still the decisiveness was missing. And without a clear guidance from the very top, all what the regional governors could do, they were just standing aside, trying to minimize the damage inflicted to the region. This was the policy in Rostov, also the Voronezh region, Lipetsk region, so on the route of the convoy toward Moscow. What was staggering for me, first, the lack of decisiveness. Second, the lack of any deployable reserves from the side of the Russian state. I mean, there was apparently not a single land force unit or ground force unit which could have been deployed to stop the convoy or to prevent Wagner from taking over significant parts of the Rostov region and also the way towards Moscow. The earliest unit that was possible to deploy was the airborne division from Tula, but that was already very close to Moscow. So the lack of reserves, deployable reserves, was my second lesson. The third was that the police, the Ministry of Interior, disappeared completely. I mean, during the whole crisis, you did not see a single policeman trying to do anything, even to moderate the events or to keep events at bay, even to minimal extent. So I think one of the losers, the less published losers of the whole story, is Minister of Interior Kolkov. It also turned out that Wagner was able to take over or at least isolate the Russian military bases on its way. But Prigozhin said that some units joined him. This is probably not entirely true. But the military bases, his forces sealed, isolated, or possibly took over, definitely did not resist. Which also leads to the fourth point, massive intelligence failure. It is it is quite unimaginable for me that FSB or the military intelligence would not have been informed about what was about to happen. Anyways, Wagner Group has been closely cooperating, very closely cooperating with Russia's military intelligence. Its supplies, its weaponry, its ammunition have all been dependent on the close cooperation with the Russian military. So the military intelligence certainly had information about what was to happen. Yet still, the Kremlin was surprised and the Kremlin was undecisive, which leads to the question, to what extent intelligence information is forwarded to Putin, and to what extent Putin is ready to listen to such information. Taking into account what happened, probably there are serious problems and mishaps in how, let's put it like this, inconvenient intelligence information is forwarded to the president on time. Last thing to answer Nastya's question about how does this affect the front line. In the short run, effects are close to minimal. Why? Because Wagner left the front line after they took Bakhmut in the beginning of June. So Wagner was not a frontline unit at the moment when they started the mutiny. First, so they were not missing from the front line when they started their happy march on Rostov. Second, when they took over the command of the southern military district, they took over the building but did not disrupt the functioning of the command, of the headquarters. This is very important. Prigozhin wanted to disrupt the Kremlin, probably, but not the front line. So during Saturday, which was a fairly turbulent day in Moscow, the southern military command could operate almost unhindered. So the front was not affected directly. In the medium and longer run, of course, the Russian army or air force lost 6 helicopters, which is basically the losses in the Ukrainian front for a month. In one day, they lost more than they usually lose in a month in Ukraine. Plus, they also lost a very special air asset, an Ilyushin 22M air mobile command post. This was the aircraft that the Wagner shot down. This is a very, very rare asset. So this will be dearly missed in the long run. So this is a painful loss from the Russian army. And anyways, 12 or 13 Russian airmen have been killed. So when Prigozhin claimed that, we shed no blood, this was just a blatant lie. There was a fair amount of bloodshed. Possibly also at Voronezh. We don't know this yet. In the effects on Russia's military capabilities will be visible, I think, in the medium and longer run. First, Wagner as an independent unit will probably cease to exist. Even if the Ministry of Defense keep Wagner as a name, keep Wagner as a brand, there might be a brigade called Wagner, but still this will not be the coherent, well-trained, extremely well-armed force that Wagner was before. Second, of course, a lot of Wagner men will leave service because they don't want to sign contract with the Minister of Defense, or they don't trust the impunity promise of the Russian state. Well, I wouldn't trust that promise either, particularly taking into account how quickly Putin's narrative changed. Remember, Saturday morning, he claimed that this is a stab in the back, this is a treason, so people had to be taken into accountability. Saturday evening, there was a speech from Dmitry Peskov, spokesperson of the Kremlin, saying that Wagner people will be pardoned, Prigozhin is allowed to leave to Belarus, and criminal proceedings against him were closed. Sunday morning, the narrative changed again. FSB declared that no, the criminal procedures are going on. And yesterday evening, Putin gave another speech in which he again called Prigozhin a traitor and again promised that he will be taken to accountability. So if I were a Wagner fighter, I would not trust a single bit to any promise that the Russian state gives to me. So this will result in the degradation of Wagner as a fighting power in Ukraine. But, really last thing, so far it seems to be that Russia intends to keep the Wagner operations in Mali, Central African Republic, Libya, Sudan, going on and operational. So some of the foreign deployments of Wagner will continue existing, will continue working under what framework, this is yet unclear, but Wagner will not be terminated full and complete. It will probably get subordinated to the Minister of Defense under very tight control with much smaller numbers, and most probably Wagner itself will be transformed to a more or less regular military unit. So I think that this is the perspective we have at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, András. And I will already bring some questions from the chat and address two, and then hand over to Stefan. And just to mention, when you have questions, you can also raise your hands, and I will bring in to speak and ask your question. But on what you said, so two questions. First, what does this mean for Belarus? What happened, and also for Lukashenko? And here I would add also, what does it mean having Wagner group there stationed in Belarus? And on a follow-up on your last comment that Wagner will still operate, how do you see this happening? Will they do it from Belarus under his command, or will it somehow be separated, the Wagner units in African countries? And then Stefan, I'll head over to you with some questions.
Thank you. Wagner in Belarus. It looks like that the Belarusian state is preparing for the arrival of several thousand Wagner forces. They are constructing a pretty big camp for that. Whether this will be a permanent place of stationing, so whether Wagner will kind of relocate to Belarus, or whether this is only a trick to defuse the crisis in the short run and thereafter get all those people involved in the longer run, this is yet unclear. One needs to remember that Belarus once already extradited some Wagner fighters to Russia. So the guarantees possibly received from the Belarusian state are very far from rock solid. Still, one thing about Belarus, even if Wagner group gets deployed to Belarus or redeployed to Belarus, it is highly unlikely that they would attack Ukraine from the north. I mean, the Belarusian army is unable to do that. The Wagner group lost most of its heavy weaponry, and the Belarusian state doesn't want to get involved in the actual fighting in the war in Ukraine. And the arrival of some remnants of the Wagner group will not change that. When it comes to Lukashenko's position or Belarus' position, I think now he did pretty important service for the Kremlin, both in actually diffusing the crisis and also helping Putin to save face to such an extent. So probably in the short run, the freedom of maneuver of Lukashenko, let's not call it autonomy anymore, but freedom of maneuver of Lukashenko has probably increased a bit. But again, the crisis with Wagner is not yet over. There are thousands of Wagner fighters with whom the Russian state needs to do something. So far, there seem to be three options. First, they can join the Russian army. That's the easiest from the Kremlin's perspective. Second, they could just leave armed service and go back to civilian life. In the short run, this solves the problems, but then will result in a lot of people with military experience and PTSD, all that, getting back to the society. Third option, they may leave to Belarus. How many Wagner fighters will choose which option, this is yet unclear. But as long as these people are still around, still armed, we really need to watch closely, because this is far from being completely over.
Thank you. And Stefan, there are already a couple of questions for you in the chat. I'll start with the question from Stefan Mele. How do you see this rebellion and the implications for the future elections in Russia? I think it's an important question. How do you see the consequences? Do you expect that there will be more repressions? But then I think that could also, I would combine it also with another question that we had on, do you think that this also opens, so in a way, a door for other rebellions? And when this happens, because Putin didn't really, there was no strong support from the elites in the beginning. Everyone was waiting to see what is going to happen, what he's going to say. So do you think that in the future, then there are new rebellions, or let's say there is another coup attempt, Putin will not be able to count on his close circles?
Okay, I just want to add two or three things I just didn't mention before, because I didn't want to speak too long. I think what was crucial also during these events, that nobody went over to Prigozhin. So I think there was a moment where maybe there was a kind of unclarity if he gets support from the military or from the security services. And there was, I think that was the main reaction. It was not, okay, it was Putin's speech, But then not much came out of the Kremlin. But we saw several high-ranking people like Surovikin, who is a former supporter also of Prigozhin, who supported Putin. Kadyrov very quickly also supported Putin. And I think that was a very important moment that in the end, the whole system supported Putin in a time where he seemed to be not able to react adequately to give the right direction and say the things which were necessary to do. Also, governors showed loyalty to Putin. So I think that means the system is working in a way, the support is working. But if Putin is really not able to decide things, I don't see at the moment anybody else who is challenging Putin. But for me, this is really a kind of a black swan. Maybe from a Ukrainian perspective, it's a white swan. But for Russia, it's a kind of something which happens and you don't expect. And it can be someone else from the security services, because I think these are the only actors who have the power resources to do a kind of a coup. I think we don't know if Putin is really able to react. And then it's really a question if he again gets this kind of support. So I don't see this at the moment, but we didn't expect that this is happening and goes so quickly. I think the second thing is that we saw quite a lot of support for Wagner also from the society. There was quite a positive reaction also in a way, and I think there is it's a demobilized society. But I think you can see that people are not happy with the whole situation, whatever it means. I can also imagine that people like Prigozhin has a kind of a image in parts of the society, who is a strong man, who challenged also the elites, in a way. But you can also see that there is a kind of unhappiness with the war, with the decision making, and with the whole situation in Russia. So what does it mean for future elections in Russia? Next year we have a presidential election. I don't think that this highly personalized system is able to change. So I think for Putin personally, it's crucial that he stays in power. So I don't expect any change in the planning that Putin gets reelected. I think they will. It's still my thesis. Still, they will do kind of cleansing, maybe in the system also, and nobody, even less now, is safe anymore in the system itself. Yeah. And I think they will prepare the elections even better. But I don't see any challenger for Putin. So I think these elections are under control. So I think we will see more repression, and we will see a kind of unsafety, especially of the elites. And maybe and maybe likely also kind of cleansing in the security sector. I can imagine. So, and I think on the rebellion, on additional, I think I already said that there is an option. I think people observed how the lack of decisiveness of Putin. So I think we now understand where are the weaknesses and where could be the cracks also in the system itself.
And just a quick follow-up, and then I go back to András, and it's also a question from the chat. But do you think that's also now a sign that Prigozhin wants to distance himself from Putin and is preparing his own political career, considering that he's also quite popular?
I think we should not overestimate Prigozhin. He relied very much on the funding of the Russian military. Sure, he's a social media star. I think he has his own social media channels, and I think that made him quite popular. And he could say things nobody was able to say, in Russia. But if he is a person, first thing, is he really so popular? I think he's popular among a special cohort of the Russian society, especially men. In a specific age, I think he's quite popular. But he's no one you can control. So I think the system will never allow a person to get in power who is not under control in a way. And I don't see that he has the power resources really to challenge Putin and to challenge the system in a way. I don't think so. And I even would say Wagner's reached the peak also. I think they lost a lot of really high qualified people in the fights in Ukraine, and they will not play a decisive role in Ukraine anymore. I think they might even move really to other countries in the world. I can also imagine Prigozhin might move to Africa, because I'm pretty sure he's not safe in Belarus. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. There's Russian intelligence and military. I think they somehow control the country. It's not Lukashenko. So I don't think that he's safe in any way in Belarus.
Thank you. András, you wanted to add?
Just one thing to the mutiny. Yes, it's very important what Stefan said, that no significant player joined Prigozhin. So the governors, the Siloviki, the politicians all stayed loyal to Putin. So nobody openly joined the rebellion. But at the same time, it was indicative how many oligarchs, politicians, and political figures escaped Moscow during Saturday. There was a massive outflow of private jets from Moscow. So a lot of key players of the Putin system actually left Moscow, either for St. Petersburg or for abroad. So for me, this appeared a bit like, yes, nobody is joining the rebellion, but very few people were actually ready to fight for Putin either. And the speed and number of people leaving Moscow immediately, I mean, members of the elite, it also indicated that these people were seriously concerned about whether the system was actually able to stop Prigozhin. Because had they been feeling safe in their positions in Moscow, they wouldn't have just left the city. And these people know how Putin works, or at least know to some extent, and these people have a much more detailed knowledge on the internal dysfunctionality of the system than we do. So the speed of how quickly they left Moscow, I think, is indicative also to the internal functionality of the system.
And I just add one sentence. I think the problem is really there are very few people have access to Putin. So people don't know where he really is, in which condition he really is, and they cannot assess really how this decision-making process is done anymore. So he's not balancing anymore between different interest groups like it was like 10 years ago, but he's now the only decision maker who has very few people with whom he makes decision and has nearly no correctives anymore in the system. And he gets only selective information. And I think what we also saw with the speech, he's really somewhere else. So he's in history somewhere, yeah, and talking about 1917 and so on. But I think Russia is now in a war. There was kind of a coup on the weekend going on, and there was a president who was talking about history and the fight against the West. So I think this losing reality, I think this is what people really realize also in Russia, who do not support this war, who do not like what happens with Russia, but sure, are afraid of what can happen to them. But we see really now the vulnerabilities of a system where we were pretty sure that it is relatively stable. And I think it is much less stable than we thought in a couple of weeks ago.
Thank you. I will bring one more question from the chat, and I just wanted to say that I think we have time for maybe one or two questions, so you can also raise your hand and write it down in the chat. But Gudrun Dometate, I hope I pronounced it correctly, asked in the chat, so what do you think about this theory that maybe this was more or less staged? I think a lot of people discussed it in the weekend. That was in the Telegram channels, at least I was reading on Friday night and on Saturday. What's your take on that? I will give it who of you wants to answer. If you have a take on that.
Just maybe I think some things are really strange. Yeah, so I still would say some things also with Lukashenko. I think that I'm not so sure. Like András was saying, if this really improves the bargaining position or somehow the leeway of Lukashenko, I think he's so much under control. I don't think so. But that's really a strange thing. Did he really needed Lukashenko to make this deal? Maybe he didn't want to talk about it. Also, this lack of decisiveness. But I think what we have to understand that for Putin, this is really undermining his power position. It's really he's a hard man. Yeah, so he's an authoritarian leader. He needs to show strength, and I think that was not the case. So if there might have gone negotiations behind the screens, already going on, and Prigozhin maybe improved his bargaining position in this situation. I think when we have seen maybe a lot of things we have not seen, and we have maybe also not seen people also in the system who did support him in a way, or maybe also Putin had not some informations he should have had. András was talking about intelligence failure. So and Americans were saying they should have known it at least one day before, also the moves and everything. So I think there are some strange things. But I think still, for me, this is something which is really very negative for Putin and the Putin system and the stability of the regime. So I think that's nothing you just initiate to do then an attack from Belarus or for what? So I think that's one of the other conspiracies we have at the moment.
And just a small element of formal logic. So the assessment that some parts of it were staged or the whole thing got entirely out of control, these are not contradictory statements. It's perfectly possible that initially Prigozhin was tricked into doing this, but thereafter he just overplayed his cards and the thing just went way too far. I mean, one possible assessment is that some people, likely around the Minister of Defense, convinced Prigozhin that if he starts that mutiny, then some elites, some members of the military, some military units would join him. But it didn't happen. But once Prigozhin was tricked into it, and once he started his march, from then on, things really spiraled out of control. And the possible gains way outweighed the losses which occurred. I mean, I fully agree with Stefan. Now the weakness and dysfunctionality of the system has been exposed so crystal clear that simply the benefit of subordinating Wagner to the Minister of Defense, it is just not worth of all what happened during Saturday. So even if this was a trick, even if this started as some kind of a stage thing, it went out of control and inflicted significant damage on the credibility of the system as a whole.
Thank you. And I'll also bring now Olga Karaj. She also mentioned in the chat about Prigozhin's connection to Viktor Sheyman. And Olga, if you want to ask a question, please, if you could turn also your camera on or just the audio and go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for the possibility to listen. Very important points. And I just want to add something maybe as a person inside the process, because I'm from Belarus. And we will following the situation very, very, very careful. I would like to give you some kind of points. Maybe it should be helpful. First of all, everything was what was connected. It's very what was happens is very connected to transgeneration trauma of Russia and what was happens in Soviet Union. Please don't forget about, because in Soviet Union the criminal culture was some kind of opposite of Soviet culture. When Putin spoke and he sent the message to Prigozhin, maybe do you remember, he says that this is the Prigozhin is some kind of new Lenin, and this is quite interesting because it was quite the system was very close to collapse, by my opinion, especially because Prigozhin was playing with the role of criminal, authority, etc., etc. And I'm not sure about the Ukrainian army that they can go so quickly to Moscow, because the most important thing is reaction of Russian popularity. People met Prigozhin with flowers, it was not any kind of struggling, because people saw him as revolutionary and the person who can release Russia from the corruption system. But Prigozhin was not ready to the role. He was not ready to transform the system, and by my opinion, the system is showing the sustainability and resilience. Sorry. And what is important for me, I agree with András that the Wagner is not exist anymore. Prigozhin is killed as politician, because according to the criminal culture, no, he cannot take any negotiations with Putin and his system. This is strongly forbidden. And also one very important question for the Russian society, and the question is quite invisible but very big, the question about the death of 13 pilots. Because maybe do you remember when the Prigozhin's army, Wagner, was coming, some people in the Russian army tried to stop him, and some of them were killed. So it was no responsibility for Wagner anymore for such kind of death. And for many people, it's very open question, about the social justice. And about, by my opinion, the situation was very interesting. Or Prigozhin will take everything, or he will lose everything. So nothing in middle, and so, but he was stopped in middle. Why Belarus is very clear, because Victor Sheyman, who is involved in very criminal activities of Lukashenko, he's very connected to Wagner. And Wagner is, some groups of Wagner was already in Belarus, and even some instructors of Wagner are involved to train child soldiers in Belarus. So maybe do you know that Lukashenko prepared 2,000 child soldiers, and some Wagner instructors and Chechenian instructors are involved in the process. So by my opinion, if we speak about, sorry to speak so long, but I just finished. If we speak about Belarus, what happens? For Prigozhin now, it's a very complicated situation. He has to show that he is still helpful for the Putin system. Otherwise, he will be killed. So now he has to think some kind of creative, in his way, idea how to show that he is still a part of the system. So maybe Africa, but I'm not sure. Maybe it should be happens in our region. I'm much more skeptical about. And I'm not think about some kind of controversial relationship between Wagner and Lukashenko now. Maybe yes, in future, because Lukashenko's structures are also very criminal. But Wagner is very discredited now for people who support criminal culture. So we will see. But by my opinion, we should wait some kind of provocations from Belarus for neighborhood, for Ukraine, maybe for Baltic countries, Poland. But Wagner will have to show that he's still important, or he can play some kind of role. Thank you very much. And also, I give the links for our analysis in German. Maybe it should be interesting to read much more about criminal culture and some kind of consequence as we see the process.
Yeah, you can send it in the chat, and I thank you for coming in. I think we just have 1 minute, and I have just the last question. So your takes, what happens to Prigozhin now? Is he gonna live? How long? What do you think? A bit of speculation, but I think that would be a good question to end.
Will I start, or just everybody? No, I think I agree. I think this is also what I already said. I think he's not safe anymore. In the end, the system has to kill him, and I don't see that I think he lost his relevance for the system in a way, and also with Wagner. And that's why he's free now to be killed. And the system has even to show strength in killing him and setting this as a precedent. Yeah. So, and I'm very skeptical if he finds something which is useful. So it could be in Africa, and I still think he moves to Africa maybe, because I think that's maybe the most safest place for Prigozhin at the moment. It's not Belarus in my opinion. But I think this struggle will go on, because Prigozhin and the loyal Wagners will struggle for survival. Yeah. So, and they will do everything to survive, but I'm very skeptical if they will manage.
And to continue the same logic, I cannot recall anybody from Russian history who organized an armed mutiny, did not win, but survive. I just cannot recall anybody. So I'm fairly pessimistic about the future of precaution.
Yeah, on this, I don't know, I wouldn't say a positive note, but interesting note. I would like to thank you again, András and Stefan, for your inputs. And also, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the DGAP for organizing it and for the audience for joining and having an interactive discussion. Thank you very much. I wish you a very nice Tuesday. And we stay all in touch. Have a good day. Bye-bye.